Thank you, Thomas, for the introduction, and welcome to the participants. So, as Thomas said, this webinar is about promoting the rights of children in migration through the next MFF, the next multi-annual financial framework. So, just to give you an overview of this, yes, just before starting the presentation, we would like to ask you if you are familiar with the multi-annual financial framework, yes or no. So, no. Okay. And then
and I'm matching the second.
Yeah, and then I have a second question. If you are working on advocacy on these funds, no, that's fine. So it's a good opportunity to learn more about it. So we hope that the presentation will provide you some good support. So to give you an overview, we will explain you who we are and what we're here today, and then we'll give you a general overview of the multi-annual financial framework, and then we'll go in details on the European Social Fund Plus.
Sorry, Letizia, sorry to interrupt. Can you come a bit closer to your computer because it's very silent?
Sorry.
Okay.
Much better. Sorry, Rob.
Thank you. So, as I said, we will go through a quick overview of the MFF in general. Then we go in details talking about the European Social Fund Plus, then the Asylum and Migration Fund, and then the Neighbourhood Development International Cooperation Instrument, NDICI. So, as I said, here, Robert, Kieran, and myself, we represent three organizations: the Zom International Federation, Europe and Save the Children, and together we have produced a position paper on the MFF and children in migration, also with the collaboration of Stacy Topuzova, and we have used this publication in our work, and we'll continue to do so. So, to give a quick overview about the multi-annual financial framework, basically, this is the long-term budget of the EU. Every year, the EU approves a budget, and every 7 years, the member states and the Parliament and the Commission decide how this budget should work for 7 years, how much money should go into this budget, and for what policy priorities. So clearly, it is a key process, and it's very important, not only for 1 year, but for 7 years. And the next MFF will cover we start in 2021 and will end in 2027. So how does it work in practice? Well, you have the different regulations, so text of EU laws, one presenting the structure of the MFF and how much money goes into different funds. And then there are other regulations on separate funds, and we will discuss a bit some of those later today. So this slide gives you an overview of the structure of the MFF 2021-2027. On the left, we can see here the proposal that the European Commission made in May 2018. So it proposed a new budget of 1,144 billion over 7 years and over different policy areas that go. So in here on the right, we can see another graph. So here we see in blue, we see the budget, the MFF for the current MFF between 2024 and 2020. And then the orange chart is about the MFF 2021-27. And as you can read, it covers single market, innovation, and then cohesion and values. And we will focus on this part of the MFF to talk about the European Social Fund. Then we will go into the heading number 4, the 4th chapter, we can say, of the MFF that deals with migration and border management, to talk about the Asylum and Migration Fund. And then we will go into the heading number 6, which focuses on the neighborhood and the world, where we will talk about the NDICI. And here I give the floor to Robert.
Thanks, Leticia. Hello, everyone. As mentioned, I'm Robert from Save the Children Europe. So I Save the Children's office here in the EU. I'm working across the MFF on the European Social Fund and the Asylum and Migration Fund with another colleague working on the NDICI. So just to give you an idea of the MFF timeline. So as Leticia mentioned, the MFF starts with proposals from the European Commission. So they propose an overall MFF. They also propose legislation for each of the regulations. So what will become the European Social Fund, what will become the Asylum and Migration Fund, and what will become the NDICI, so the Neighbourhood Development and International Cooperation Instrument. So this began in May and June of last year, 2018, where the Commission made these proposals for what the amount of money that would be in each fund and what would be funded through each fund. So moving on from that, the 2 other institutions from the EU then also will have a look at the proposal and they will adopt their position. So this happened between June of 2018 and March of 2019. So the European Parliament, made up of all the MEPs from the member states, adopted their position on the ESF Plus, on the AMF, and also on the NDICI. And then at the same time, the Council, which is made up of representatives of each of the member state governments, so each EU country will have a number of civil service employees based in Brussels for each thematic area, so covering, say, justice, covering social affairs, covering development, and every other thematic area, but these are the ones that we're most concerned about. So they will also have a look at the proposal from the Commission, they will make their changes and they'll adopt their position. So that's the point we've reached now, that each of these institutions has their own position, so 3 different positions on the files, and now we're moving towards a compromise so that we can agree on one agreed text, which will then be made into law. So this process is called trilogue negotiations. So between the 3 institutions. So you can see there on the screen a bit of a visualization of that, with the European Commission, the European Parliament, and the Council of the European Union. So these trilogues began last month with the AMF and the NDICI, and just on Monday they began for the ESF Plus. So they're going to continue on throughout next year with the aim of reaching agreement in around autumn of 2020. So that will be the aim, and that the MFF could be finalised in the second half of next year.
All right, so
I just hand over to Kieran there to give some details on the European Social Fund.
thank you very much, and sorry for jumping the gun. So good afternoon and greetings from Dublin, everybody. Apologies, it's quite dark here. It's because I'm from Ireland and the weather is quite dark in general here, especially at this time of the year. But I digress. So today I'm going to just give a quick overview of the ESF Plus, and I hope that this will be the only acronym I will use in the presentation. But please forgive me otherwise. So the European Social Fund Plus, what is it? First and foremost, its purpose, as I say here, it's about focusing on the most disadvantaged and deprived groups. It fits within this new and improved inclusive growth paradigm that the EU is promoting through its funding mechanisms. And it fits with, and then overall, I mean, it's our overall recommendation in this position paper that we've created, ourselves and myself and my 2 colleagues, is that we want EU leaders and institutions to ensure that the next multi-annual financial framework will contribute to protecting and promoting the rights of all children in migration. So the ESF Plus fits very squarely within that. What the ESF is, it originally was, without the plus, it was the European Social Fund, and it was set up before to improve employment opportunities for workers in the common market and to contribute thereby to raising the standard of living in Europe. Quite a big goal. With along these same lines, we have the new ESF Plus ahead of the new financial period for the European Union. So not only is it going to, its priorities of this are there, equaling inclusive access for education specifically, but and the importance there is on inclusive as well as equal access. Then it's also about advancing the social integration of people at risk of poverty. And our latest figures that we have from 2018 is that the rate of poverty for children in Europe, for example, are at 24%. And so what's very important, and Rob will talk a bit more on in his piece on the Asylum and Migration Fund, is that this time around, the integration of the Asylum and Integration Monetary Fund and the integration component of the that funding package has been now included in the ESF for the next financial period. And this is within the idea of streamlining integration measures for people who are at risk of poverty and social exclusion in Europe. However, there are some concerns, as my colleague will talk about, so I won't steal the floor from that point. And then finally, as well, another priority is to address material deprivation and food poverty as well in Europe. And a very important thing to note about the European Social Fund Plus, why does it have a plus? Because it's incorporating a number of other funds, including the Youth Employment Initiative, funds from the 2014 to 2020 period as well. The Youth Employment Initiative, the European Social Fund itself, the European Fund for aid for the most deprived, and then finally the Employment and Social Innovation Program as well. So it's and also the EU Health Program. So it's a very large package, and the idea is it's supposed to streamline this process. Also, it's very important to note another big funding, another big package regulation as part of the new multi-annual financial framework is the Common Provisions Regulation, and this is as it states on the tin, it is a list of common provisions for the different regulations in the new financial framework. And so it's very important when looking at the fund on the ESF and indeed others that you also are cognizant of the Common Provisions Regulation and what it means. So moving on anyway to the next piece is I want to just give a quick breakdown of the numbers for you just to be aware, so much not so to go into specific discussions on it, because these numbers are subject to change in negotiation, as Robert has mentioned as well. We're currently in a trilogue process. The process of debate around the negotiation package for the European Social Fund Plus is just actually in the beginning stages. So it's what the final prices will be. We don't know yet, and this is what we're advocating on in our work. So I've just given you a brief overview of what the different proposals from the various institutions is as of the starting point. So you see the European Commission, which is the EC. Apologies for the acronym. I've already broken what I set out to do. But the European Commission has a approximation of about 89.5 billion. The European Parliament, which we have worked a lot with in the last couple of years on all three funding packages, and more generally, it's a bit more of an open space for advocacy at EU level. It's a bit easier access, I think, at least from what I've seen through my own experience. And so the European Parliament, we were successful in supporting the Parliament advocating for a much higher entry point of 106 billion. And then this is actually just fresh off the press. Last week there was a leak on the council's proposals for the multi-annual financial framework, and under that the ESF Plus was listed at 88.3 billion or 300 billion. So lower than the original European Commission proposal, which is something, I suppose it's not but not a huge amount lower, but I suppose it's not something as a large surprise, given that currently the context is that European member states want to invest less. And when governments want to invest less, oftentimes social programs and funding around this area is what goes first and foremost, or at least is most vulnerable to cuts, which I guess goes back to the reason why we're here today, because it's very important to develop capacity and knowledge around advocacy in this area and work together to actually ensure that children in migration, and by proxy, children as a whole, are protected through the next round of EU funding. So if you could move on, please, that would be great. So with this in mind, we in our paper, and I absolutely recommend you guys to read. I already did a quick wave, but I'll flag it again. I would wholeheartedly recommend you take a look. There are links on this presentation, and you know what? I'll find the link and I'll share it on the chat as well. And if anyone wants to get a start on the read, it's available on our respective websites of the organizations as well. And basically, this position paper, we've had a look at multiple funds. Today, we're featuring 3, as you know from listening, hopefully so far. But there are other funds as well that are included too, all examining the specific context of children and migration. So with that in mind, what I've done here is I've listed our recommendations for the European Social Fund Plus. And again, I see acronyms, I'm sorry guys, but I will say them out loud in full. So what I've done is I've highlighted the European parliamentary positions in blue. The standard text as from the European Commission is black. European Parliament entries are in blue, and then things that we are, in addition to these entries, we are advocating for are in red as well. So first and foremost, we want the European Social Fund Plus to be in line with international treaties and frameworks calling for the rights of children and children in migration specifically to be protected. This is the UN Convention of the Rights of the Child, including its general comments on public budgeting. Then we also have we want to see the European Commission 2013 recommendation on investing in children with the subheading of breaking the cycle of disadvantage. It's a very comprehensive framework, and we want to see this incorporated. And then of course you have the European Union Charter for Fundamental Rights as well. We want these frameworks to be included, and we were successful, and Parliament have successfully supported that this is included in their proposal. So now we see what happens with the trialogue process. Next, we want to link it to the 2030 agenda and the Sustainable Development Goals. The European Commission has already stated that they are lining up their funds in line with this. So we are hopeful that we are expecting this to stay in place, but it is a recommendation nonetheless. Thirdly, we have including children and migrants in definition of the most deprived. So with the Parliament, they have included children in their definition of the most deprived persons, along with people with disabilities and people with Roma backgrounds and so on and so forth, other disadvantaged groups and demographics. So we want children and migration to be explicitly stated in this. So this is a point here. So just quickly, the most deprived persons, what it means, it's natural persons, whether individuals, families, households or groups composed of such persons, including children from the Parliament proposal and homeless people as well as other disadvantaged groups. Number 4, we want eradicating child poverty as a general objective. Quite clear. As I mentioned already, statistics are showing that 24% of all children, although it varies across country and varies widely and regionally across countries, 24% of all children in Europe are at risk of poverty and are social exclusion. So we want this as an explicit priority because we recognize the intersectionality of this, and we're pleased to see this in the proposals from the Commission. We also want to measure the number of children benefiting from the European Social Fund. We want this to be built into it, again, from the European Commission. If you could change the slide, please, that'd be great. Thank you. And so here is where we get to a bit more. So we want to increase the earmarking for social inclusion. So a very important component of the European Social Fund Plus is that it has an earmarking of, I believe the initial proposal is 25% from the European Commission of EU member states' money that needs to be allocated towards addressing social inclusion. It's a very important allocation, but we believe it can be higher. And why? Because basically in the European Social Fund, the previous fund, a total amount of 20% was allocated for European Social Fund resources to be spent on this objective, this thematic objective in EU terms. And then basically what this is promoting social inclusion, combating poverty and any discrimination. And this amount is actually being exceeded by member states on average of 25.6 to be exact. So over 25% of ESF resources, European Social Fund resources, was used by member states in the previous funding period. So this lower benchmark is not enough. Now, the European Commission are advocating for 25% on the back of that previous allocation of European Social Fund money to be targeted on inclusion, social inclusion. However, we want more, so we are advocating for 30%. It is important to note the Parliament's position, which came out earlier this year, before the end of the previous legislature. But there's a new European Parliament in place, as I'm sure you're all aware, and from what we're seeing, they're holding to the previously agreed proposals as well, which is good. Some of the same people are in play there in the Parliament. So they are advocating for 27%. So we will see how things go, but we will continue to push for 30%. Then number 7 is earmarking an additional 4% of the European Social Fund Plus to address explicitly material deprivation, including, and again specifying, because specifying is very important here if we are to advocate for these at national level and European level, and to make sure that the EU follows through on their commitments to pressurize at national level too. So earmark 4%, an additional 4% of the fund to address material deprivation. So which is okay, yes, for children and migration. Then penultimately we have, finally, we number 8, we have our earmarking 5% for the European Social Fund Plus for a European child guarantee. And my next slide, I'll talk a little bit more about what that is and why that's important to us. And so this was a commitment that is in the that came from the Parliament earlier this year, and it's something that we've been advocating for in Brussels and with Your Child and with Save the Children, as well as many other children's rights organizations here in Brussels. We are advocating for a child guarantee that will provide for all children in Europe. And so this earmarking of 5% is very important. Unfortunately, as I mentioned briefly a while ago at the very beginning, with the European Council position, so the European Council's there was a document recently last week released on the proposals from the Council. It was leaked before it was supposed to be published, and it did not mention the child guarantee in its text. So it's something that we are continuing to advocate for, and ourselves in Your Child and Save the Children are very actively advocating for this as well, meeting with permanent representatives of national governments to the EU to continue our work for this. And we've got some broad commitment, so let's see if we can follow through. Finally, as I mentioned at the beginning of my presentation, I just wanted to highlight this enabling condition, inverted commas, 4.3 from the Common Provisions Regulation. So this is also in our paper, but if you have a look, you can see a bit more about what this entails. But basically, we want this provision to include specifically, explicitly children in migration. And so what that means is that the enabling conditions 4.3 basically is a requirement for member states when they're accessing funds to the European Social Fund or other funding instruments as well, some of the bigger funding instruments in the EU funding, the budget. So what it requires is that member states have in place national strategies for addressing poverty and social inclusion. And this is extremely important as well. It also includes this participation of civil society in the preparation of these national frameworks as well. So having this condition to explicitly state children in migration is a very, very important potential victory if we can, a target for us to aim for when we're advocating with the member states and with the EU as a whole on the next budget. Great. Could you move on to the next one, please? Thank you kindly. And so finally, not finally, but I wanted to just briefly give an overview of the child guarantee and what it is and what it's about. So basically the ambition is it's guaranteeing a successful childhood for every child in Europe, and it has a potential for change in all of for children in the EU, and by ensuring that there is access to 5 key services that are being identified. It was an initiative brought forward by the Socialists and Democrat group in the European Parliament, and it's something that we have strongly supported all the way through. And what does it entail? It entails access to these 5 services: healthcare, education, childcare, decent housing, and adequate nutrition. And also it provides for increased visibility and transparency in terms of the checks it will put in place for prioritizing reforms around children and children in migration, and also ensures that there'll be transparency in terms of monitoring and measuring what will be actually delivered under these funds. So it's basically an allocation of the European Social Fund that is directed towards and ensured for the betterment of children in Europe. So we're advocating for that. It's a little bit, I guess, I think it could also be seen as a bit of a spiritual successor to a youth guarantee in terms of its goals for addressing a population, a vulnerable and one of the more vulnerable demographics in Europe. So finally, I just want to say, where do we go next with this? As I mentioned, the trilogue negotiations are starting on the European Social Fund Plus, and so we'll be continuing to monitor those. And we just last week, and maybe the guys might also touch on it too, but we had a roundtable in the European Parliament with leading civil society, but also members from the EU institutions, so the Parliament and the Commission and the Council, representatives from member states. We had a roundtable last week, and there was from unfortunately, I wasn't there myself, but I was represented by my colleague and the two guys here as well. But MEP, there was broad support for the child guarantee, as well as the development of a comprehensive strategy on the rights of the child, which was announced recently in the new European Commission, in the mission letters of the new commissioners. So these are very positive, big picture developments, and we are advocating, and there is broad support from our allies, at least last week, and the Parliament, for children and migration to be explicit priorities in these tools. So it's, yeah, like I said, it's a promising start, and we'll follow the trilogues from there, I guess. And yes, that's everything for me. But if anyone has any questions, please do ask, and if not, type, and I'm here. Any questions? No?
Yeah.
Oh, hello.
Hello, good morning. It's Fleming from Italy, from Save the Children Italy.
Hey.
Good morning, everyone. So my question is about this last point about the situation now that the child guarantee seems not to be included in the proposal.
Yes.
I can't figure out now what is going to happen, because you said that if it's not in this proposal, we risk to have it out of next programming budgeting. So what could be the options? So did you imagine the next scenarios if this child guarantee is not included in this final proposal? Thank you.
Yeah, thank you very much. Yes, Rob.
To just say so. Hi, Flemini. Hi, Robert from the Save the Children EU office. So we discussed with some permanent representations after it wasn't included in the position, and what they've said to us is that it isn't included because there's no formal proposal for a child guarantee yet. So the Commission will be bringing forward a proposal that they've committed to it, especially Commission President Ursula von der Leyen. So they've only just come into office this week, so there'll have to be a process where it is proposed of what they think a child guarantee should be, and only at that point would the Council, would the Member States consider putting it in their position. So it doesn't necessarily mean that they've ruled it out. And because it was included in the Parliament's position, it means that it will be discussed in the trilogues. And this might be part of the reason why the trilogues have been delayed. They only started this week as well, whereas the other funds, the trilogues started last month and the month before, even in October. So it's something. It doesn't mean that it's not on the agenda just because it hasn't been included as of yet. Obviously, it would have been good if it was, but what the indications are that we have is that it's because there isn't a formal proposal yet. So the way the Member States look at it is that the child guarantee is just a concept until the Commission brings something forward, and then they'll discuss it.
Very good. And indeed, as Rob mentioned, there's broad political support for the child guarantee from the European Commission. It's in the mission letters of a number of the commissioners, and Ursula von der Leyen, as you mentioned, the new president of the Commission, has also mentioned it more than once as well in her addresses publicly. So, like Rob said, we expect it to go forward, but indeed, it's important to keep on it as well with Member States. And yeah, it's good to know that there's the commitment from the Member States as well. And I know that a number of Member States are already engaged and already supportive broadly of the child guarantee as well as a concept, as a tool. So that's positive to see as well.
And including the Italian permanent representative,
including,
one of their representatives was at their meeting last week, where she again raised the importance of the child guarantee. So it should still be on the agenda going forward.
Yeah, great. So I think without further ado, I'll pass on to yourself, Rob, for the AMF.
Thanks.
Thank you, everyone.
Okay, so so we discussed the overall budget earlier. So on this pie chart here, you can see the proportion of the budget that is made up by the Asylum and Migration Fund. So overall, there was around 3% of the EU budget is going towards migration-related funds, and a third of this is going to the Asylum and Migration Fund. So 10.4 billion, and that is represents around 1% of the overall EU budget. So as we were mentioning at the moment, both the Commission has made a proposal, the Parliament has their position, and also the Member States have their position. So as we were discussing, there's trilogue negotiations where they will discuss and reach compromise, and we will have a finalised legal text. So as some of you may know, the Asylum Migration Fund is the primary fund for funding migration-related programs across Europe. So you might have benefited from MFF funding in the past, or you may, if not, many of the civil society organisations in your country would have done so. It's had a proud record of supporting many innovative programs, particularly for smaller NGOs and in partnership with local authorities. So in the new funding period, the Commission has proposed their proposal for the AMF. So previously it was the AMIF in 2014 to 2020, so the Asylum, Migration and Integration Fund, and they've proposed it would be changed to the Asylum and Migration Fund, so that the integration aspects would be dropped and would move to primarily to the European Social Fund. So integration in the short term would remain under the AMF, and these would be actions generally implemented in the first year. So mainly around language courses was the type of things that were envisaged to stay. So an initial integration services provided to people in reception centres, for example, after initial arrival, but the long-term needs of people will be met through the European Social Fund. And while this has positive aspects in terms of mainstreaming programming under the European Social Fund and not necessarily dividing people into citizens and non-citizens, there's also risks with it. Because the European Social Fund has been very employment-based. It's been about increasing employment, jobs training, and it maybe doesn't have as a holistic approach the way that the AMF has done in the past. So we would advocate that that long-term integration would be funded through the AMF going forward, as well as through the European Social Fund, so that the European Social Fund can focus on more employment-related aspects of integration, and the AMF could continue to provide its more holistic approach with more tailored actions for third country nationals. So we can discuss this further, because this approach has been taken forward by the Parliament and by the member states. But just to touch on the rest of the big changes from the Commission's proposal, another big one is that the budget has increased. So the budget is going from 3.1 billion to 10.4 billion. So more than a threefold increase, and that's in the context of most other funds across the MFF being decreased. So it's very clear that migration is a priority for the Commission going forward, and hopefully that will lead to opportunities for civil society to access these funds. But the risk is that it doesn't go towards these type of programs, and perhaps the fact they were looking to remove integration from the funds, it gives a signal as to what their intentions were. But in general, the AMF would have three specific objectives under the Commission's proposal. So the first would be to strengthen the common European asylum system, and including an external dimension. So that's the rules around asylum in the EU. So it would involve improving reception centres, improving asylum procedures, so generally quite positive elements, but more that would be funded more through the state than through civil society. Then secondly, the key priority for us, for most civil society organisations, is supporting integration measures within the EU for third country nationals, and also legal migration to the EU. So that's a very key priority for us, and we're glad to see it mentioned. But as I said, we want to ensure that integration will cover long-term and not just short-term integration. And the third, then, less positive priority is countering irregular migration through returns and cooperation with third countries. Okay, and this third criteria, this third objective of the European Commission leads into a key aspect of their proposal, is the increased focus on externalisation of the fund. So there's indications that they want to have more of the AMF and third countries outside the EU to prevent migration and to tackle root causes, and have less on programs within the EU. So there's also a link with the discussion in the NDICI, the development instrument, where there's also discussion about using development funding on migration, and Letty will talk a bit more about that in the next section. And then, as an overall just point about the proposal, there was no specific reference to children in the Commission's proposal, which was different from the previous proposal, and that's something that we've been advocating on, to have specific references to children in the fund. Okay, so moving on to the European Parliament. So we worked very closely with the European Parliament as they were negotiating their position last year, and we managed to have a lot of our priorities included in their position, which is very good. So the first big change that they proposed is to bring the I back, so to bring integration back into the Asylum Migration Fund and turn it back into the Asylum Migration and Integration Fund. So they would remove this distinction between short-term integration and long-term integration, and the AMF will continue to fund integration for the long term. So this, while also the European Social Fund would continue to provide integration services as well. So there would have to be complementarity between the two funds to ensure there's no gaps. But the idea was that they would both have a role going forward in both short-term and long-term integration. And then in terms of the objectives of the fund, they propose to widen the objectives. So instead of having the three objectives mentioned before, they would keep the objective on the common European asylum system. They would keep the objective on returns, but they would separate the objective on integration and legal migration into two separate priorities. So there will be a priority on supporting integration in the EU and a separate priority on promoting legal migration to the EU, which they're very different things that you can imagine. So we're supportive of that, and we think integration itself should be a distinct priority, and also supporting legal migration should be a key priority, especially if they're talking about countering irregular migration. And finally, they added one more, which is on solidarity and fair burden sharing between the member states. So this is linked to the reform of the Dublin regulation. So the AMF would have a role in that reform in terms of promoting solidarity and the sharing across the member states, and could finance this. Okay, and another key thing, calling back to the fact there was no reference to children in the Commission's proposal. We worked with the Parliament, and there's a number of references to children now, and a key one is the insertion of a definition of an unaccompanied minor. So this was something that had been included in the previous regulation, but had for some reason been removed, and now it's been reinserted. And the reason this is key is because it has quite a broad definition of an unaccompanied minor, and it's crucial to ensure that unaccompanied minors will be given guardians as soon as possible after their arrival in the EU. So that's the link there. And one final point is calling back to the specific objectives. A key problem with the proposal from the Commission was that they listed out their 3 objectives, but they didn't oblige member states to spend any proportion of their money on each objective. So a large portion of the AMF is given to member states, and then civil society can apply to access this funding to implement programs. But there was no obligation for member states to be proportionate. So they could, in theory, you could spend all your money on return and very little on integration or supporting legal migration. And there was an analysis done by ECRE during the last funding period, and a number of countries did just this, including the UK spent almost 90% of their money on returns. So we want to avoid this going forward. So we've advocated for this with the Parliament, and they have proposed that there would be a minimum of 20% obligations to be spent on common European asylum system. There will be a minimum of 10% on supporting legal migration to the EU. There will be a further 10% on funding integration in the EU, and a final 10% minimum on ensuring solidarity and fair sharing between the member states. Okay, and finally, just on the council position, so the member states, the representatives of your national governments, they've also adopted their position on the AMF. And likewise with the European Parliament, they also agree with returning integration to the fund, to the title, and also explicitly saying that long-term integration of third country nationals should remain part of the AMF. So that's very welcome, and it's something that we support from their position. They've also, in their position, laid out the types of and articulate the types of programs that have been funded through the AMF, and that should continue. So this is giving a bit of guidance in terms of the how to ensure complementarity between the AMF, so how to decide, and the ESF Plus. So to lay out what should be funded through the AMF and what should be funded through the ESF Plus. So these types of things include support for family reunification, particularly for children, to allow them to be joined by their families as soon as possible, psychosocial support. There's also a number of innovative programs allowing people to transition to private housing when leaving reception centres, and finally some legal and administrative support for people who are in the asylum system or also in the migration system more broadly, to ensure that they're allowed to have the best chance with their case, essentially. So these type of programs, you can see, wouldn't normally fit within the European Social Fund Plus with its more employment-based focus. So you can see these are the types of things that could have been lost had long-term integration moved fully to the European Social Fund. Okay. One more other positive element of the council position is that they've included an indicator on how many projects fund alternatives to detention under the AMF. So in the Commission proposal, there's a number of indicators to analyse the success of the fund, and as part of that, they had indicators on how many detention centres were created or improved with the support of the fund, but they didn't have a corresponding indicator on how many alternatives to detention are supported. So if we really want to move towards alternatives to detention and away from detention, we think that the success of the fund has to be measured on how it improves alternatives, particularly if it's going to be measured on how it is improved or created for the detention places. So this is a positive element of the council position. And then just finally, a negative element is, again, this focus on the external dimension. So the desire to see the AMF spent in third countries and with the unspoken aim of preventing migration. So the council position says that there'll be a dedicated significant component for tailored action to address external migration within the AMF. And there's an ongoing discussion, and this will be key in the trilogue negotiations, as to how much money will be essentially put into this dedicated component. Obviously, it's a bit vague at the moment, but it'll be a key issue going forward. And again, this has a link with the ongoing discussion on the NDICI development instrument and how much of that will be put towards migration, because you could see if that was increased, perhaps the argument for using the AMF is decreased, and vice versa. But again, Letty will discuss this further in the NDICI section. Okay, moving on to the next slide. So this is the start of our recommendation. So as Kieran has shared, we've developed a position paper on each of the funds and with some key recommendations. So on the AMF, as discussed, we think it's key that there should be a minimum allocation of resources to asylum and integration priorities. So in particular, we're advocating that 30% of the AMF should be allocated to promoting the integration and social inclusion of migrants, to ensure that this receives sufficient funding and that AMF money is not diverted towards return or towards the externalization of migrants, as opposed to programs which really promote their integration in the EU. And then linked to this is that the AMF should include the partnership principle. So this is to ensure that civil society are engaged and have meaningful participation in the design, implementation, monitoring and evaluation of AMF programs, to ensure there's a proper partnership there and that expertise of civil society can be involved all along the way to ensure the best programs are delivered for third country nationals. Okay, another recommendation and link to the previous discussion around alternatives to detention is that we believe that the AMF should have a strong role in investing in alternatives to detention. So as part of the initiative for children migration, we're pushing for the end of immigration detention of children, and key to that is showing that there are practical alternatives to detention. And this is something that has been funded through the AMF in the past, and we think should continue and should be stepped up. But what's also crucial is that these alternatives are not institutional care. So particularly for children, that if children are taken out of detention, that they're not put in institutional settings, but rather placed in the community and in family-based alternatives. So possibly foster care, for example. And linked to that, we're continuing to advocate that the AMF should not fund immigration detention of children and should not be used to create or to improve detention facilities, which is currently in the proposal, unfortunately. Okay, and linked to this is also the importance of ensuring that there's access to durable solutions for all children in migration to ensure their long-term protection and the fulfillment of their rights. And what's crucial to this is that all decisions for children should be made on a case-by-case basis and in the best interests of the child. Okay, just finally, there's two last recommendations. We have more in the paper, but these are just the key ones we wanted to highlight today. So as flagged earlier, the definition of unaccompanied minor had been removed from the proposal, and we are advocating that this will be returned to ensure that all unaccompanied and separated children are properly identified and protected and given access to their rights as soon as possible. And then the final recommendation, again on this link with the externalization. So when there's a move towards engagement with third countries, we want to ensure that where this affects children, that any engagement should involve strengthening national child protection systems. So this is rather than creation of separate facilities for children. So the idea being that if there is engagement with third countries, this needs to be about improving systems in the third countries in a spirit of real partnership with these countries, rather than just using the land of the country and creating separate facilities for children, which are distinct from their own national system. So it has to take a holistic approach if there is going to be proper engagement. And at the moment, there was a proposal from the Commission that the AMF could fund the construction of facilities in third countries for children, with the indication that this would be facilities in third countries where children will be returned. So this is something that is really worrying, and it's a key aspect of the proposal we want to remove. We convinced the Parliament to take that position, and we'll be continuing to push it in the trilogue negotiations. Okay, so that's the end of the AMF section. So we'll just pause there for a minute if anyone has any questions. And feel free to type them as well.
Okay, as we have 10 minutes left, I would really ask Letizia to continue. And if there is any question, please just type in the chat form. And if we have time, we will answer it, or later in written maybe.
Yeah. So in the interest of time, we will move to the next slide. And before going into the details about the NDICI, the new fund on development cooperation, I just wanted to quickly recall what is EU development cooperation and what is its main goal. Its main goal is to eradicate poverty, as it is established in EU treaties, but also the EU has committed to funding equality and promoting the rights of the child when acting in third countries.
Sorry, Letizia, to interrupt you, but can I ask you to move the computer in more closer to you? Okay, that's super now. Thank you.
So just to recap quickly, the EU has committed to eradicate poverty as part of, and this is the main goal of the development cooperation policy. The EU has also committed to realize the Agenda 2030 Sustainable Development and its Sustainable Development Goals. And this is also presented in European Consensus on Development, which is the shared approach of the EU and its member states to realize the 2030 agenda. And then the EU has also adopted guidelines for the promotion and protection of the rights of children. So the EU has a number of commitments and policy frameworks to implement development cooperation. And how does the EU translate those commitments into practice? The EU does this through the official development aid assistance, ODA, which basically is resources that the EU decides to allocate based on criteria established by the OECD Development Assistance Committee, which has established criteria on what is ODA and what is not. And the EU and its member states are the leading donor together. And the EU has also committed to dedicate 20% of its ODA for social inclusion and human development, which the EU defines as health, education, and social protection. But we need to remind ourselves that this target is not met, so there is more work to be done. And as a positive note, in the current MFF, 47% of the EU ODA has supported the EU to promote the rights of children in 142 countries by strengthening access to education, health, sanitation, hygiene, nutrition, health protection services, and to some extent also child participation. So we need to keep those points in mind, because this is also relevant for the future of the EU Development Cooperation Fund. In 2018, again, the Commission has proposed a new plan for a big single instrument that is called the Neighbourhood Development International Cooperation Instrument, NDICI. This is the acronym. So this single instrument will merge all the current instruments for development cooperation, but also other instruments like the European Neighbourhood Instrument. That is the instrument for the EU to implement its neighbourhood policy. The Commission has proposed that 92% of this NDICI is in line with ODA criteria, and mentioned the SDGs in the regulations. However, there were some concerns when the Commission proposed the draft of the regulation. For example, there was no reference to the Convention on the Rights of the Child and many other conventions. So the reference to human rights law was quite weak. Poverty eradication, inequality, SDGs were not in the objectives of the NDICI regulation. And then the Commission had proposed that 20% of the NDICI should be dedicated to human development, but also to gender equality. And so the concern was that for both areas, there would not be enough resources. Then the Commission proposed that 10% of migration would be dedicated to migration, to address the root cause of migration and to work on migration management. And overall, the narrative that the Commission presented in the NDICI proposal pictured migration mainly as a challenge. These slides gives you an overview of on the left of the different funds that we have until now. And on the right, you see how those funds are merged all together in the NDICI. The slide gives you an overview of how the NDICI is developed. As we don't have much time, the main point is that the geographical pillar is the main part of the instrument, and well, the big part of money will be dedicated. Now, how we have worked on the NDICI. So Terre des Hommes, Save the Children, and many other organizations have worked in coalitions to analyze the proposal of the Commission and present recommendations. These slides give you an overview of the members of Concord, which is a platform through which we have worked. And we have developed a number of recommendations and have presented those recommendations to the Parliament and the Council. As the other colleagues have said, the European Parliament was open to receive recommendations, and when they adopted the position, they took on board many of our messages. So the European Parliament proposed now to change the text of regulation to ensure there is reference to the CRC and overall a stronger human rights-based approach. Also, the Parliament wants to include poverty eradication and fighting inequalities in the objectives of the regulation, and to dedicate only to at least 20% of NDICI to human development and social inclusion, with the focus on children and women, and to separate this target from the target for gender equality, and then to have as a maximum 10% of the NDICI budget to be dedicated to migration. And then the narrative of the Parliament was more balanced, and also the European Parliament introduced stronger human rights safeguards on migration action, and also mentioned the no-refoulement principle. So the Parliament adopted this position with the previous Parliament, and the new Parliament has confirmed this position. So it has started the trial negotiations with the council based on the positions I've mentioned. There is a mistake in the slide, so this is council member state position on the NDICI. The council has very recently adopted an agreement on the NDICI and on the part that specifically relate to migration. It was very difficult for member states to agree on the text. And so from what we've heard, the member states want that at least 10% of the NDICI budget is dedicated to migration. And then they've also made reference to an incentive-based approach, whereby the EU could give more ODA to some partner countries that accept to collaborate on European migration policies, including collaboration on return and readmission. And this point is particularly concerning for the zones that there are many other organizations, because it goes against the principles for development effectiveness. And those principles says that if development can be effective only if there is ownership, accountability, transparency, and results on how ODA is spent. And when we talk about ownership, we talk about the partner country that decide on the priorities for ODA to be spent on. And so if we include this incentive-based approach, we think that we undermine those principles. And then also EU ODA should be allocated on the basis of the needs identified in the partner countries. So clearly this is not in line with this. And then the member states also agreed to have a migration facility in the NDICI. Again, it is unclear how it would work and from where the resources would be taken, from which part of the instrument. So for the figures, again, as colleagues have said before, the presidency of the council, the Finnish presidency, presented some the figures for the negotiations, and that those figures will be discussed as part of the European Council that is taking place today and tomorrow, where heads of states will decide, and heads of government will decide how the members, how many resources will go into the NDICI. So based on the latest figures we've seen, the council is proposing around 75 billion, which is a decrease compared to the Commission proposal. Now, against this background, we have a number of recommendations that you can also read in our paper. But maybe to go to the main recommendations, what we want is that the eradication of poverty and addressing inequalities are in the objectives of the NDICI, that at least 20% of the NDICI resources are dedicated to human development. So again, promoting access to education, health, and other services for all children, including migrant and refugee children. We want that the NDICI is in line with development effectiveness principles. And then when it comes specifically to the target for migration, we want that, we recommend that a maximum of 10% of the NDICI is spent on migration and not more. And then for any migration-related action implemented through the NDICI, we believe that those must be human rights compliant and child rights compliant. So the NDICI should support the EU to respond to the specific vulnerabilities and needs of our children in migration. The NDICI should support the EU to identify durable solutions for children migration, keeping the and making sure that those solutions are identified taking into account the best interests of the child. Strengthening cross-border cooperation of child protection services along migratory route is also very important to ensure a continuum of protection, care, and services. And then we recommend the no NDICI funded action would result in detention of children in migration. And finally, last but not least, children and youth immigration should be heard and participate in decisions that affect their life, and including in decisions and actions that are taken through the NDICI. I hope, I've tried to be as concise as possible. I don't know if we have time for a question, or if participants want to type any question, we will answer later.
As the time is running out, let me suggest that now we should finish. If I kindly ask the participants, if you have any question, please still feel free to use the chat form to write in, and we will try to answer them in written after the webinar. I really appreciate your participation today. Just let me launch the feedback question to get a short feedback. And thank you all for the presenters for this great insight and the details you already shared with us. I think it was really valuable. At least I learned a lot.
Thank you, Thomas.
Okay, thank you very much for the participation, and wish you a pleasant day for the rest, and good preparation for Christmas.
All right. Thank you very much, everybody.
Thank you, everyone.
Thanks.